Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome finally to the first official episode of the Sword and Sorcery Saga project. And with some reviews finally for 3 anthologies from El Sprague de Camp, including Swords and Sorcery, The Spell of 7, and Warlocks and Warriors. So I think I bit off a little more than I should have for this original episode, because in these 3 collections, it's nearly 30 stories, and I wrote almost 15 pages of notes while reading. Rest assured, I'm not going to be referencing all 15 pages of notes for this episode, but also keep in mind it is going to be a long episode, so maybe save this for a time when you can really kick back with a nice beverage and listen or watch. I am I'm going to be honest, a little apprehensive and nervous about starting this project. And a lot of that does have to do with the die-hard fans of this genre. I'm not sure I have ever encountered a more passionate group of fans. Very, very passionate fans in the sword and sorcery genre. Unfortunately, there is a lot of gatekeeping, mentality in this genre, and I kind of want to not participate in that. I kind of feel like if I say one wrong thing or disagree with the consensus, and it's going to be like, bam, these people are ready to pounce because they've taken this genre so close to their heart. And I understand that. I mean, it's easy. I mean, it's fun to be super passionate about things, but I just want people to know that I'm using this project is a quest of exploration, a quest of knowledge. This is a journey of discovery for me, because while I have dove deep into some of these authors and some of these characters and stories, my general knowledge is lacking. And so that's really why I have wanted to do this project for so long. That's the whole point of this project, a quest for knowledge. I have collected over 200 books to potentially read over the next couple years. So when it's all said and done, you and I should both have a pretty deep and wide knowledge of the sword and sorcery, sword and planet, and heroic fantasy genres, whatever you want to call this fiction. I am taking this project very seriously, but remember, I am not an expert. I'm just a dude, I'm just a guy who likes some things, as I am prone to say. But I am coming at this project as someone who wants to learn, which is why I've chosen these 3 anthologies as a starting point, because I think it is important to when you are getting into a new kind of fiction. If you take a look at the anthologies, excuse me, of the important anthologies, the revered anthologies, you can use that editor as a guide. You can use the anthologies as a roadmap to get more into this fiction. And so that's what I have done. So our first volume here is Swords and Sorcery. And Swords and Sorcery was published in 1963, and this does have a cover and some interior art by Virgil Finlay, the one and only, the great Virgil Finlay. Eventually we are going to have to be do some episodes on the artists for these books, because the art is such an important and integral part of inviting fans into the genre. I also think it is important to look at the introductions as written by de Camp. But this particular volume, which is one of the earlier anthologies that we will be taking a look at, but it includes The Valor of Captain Vara by Paul Anderson, The Distressing Tale of Thangobrian the Jeweler by Lord Dunsany, Shadows in the Moonlight by Robert Howard, The Citadel of Darkness by Harry Kuttner, When the Sea Kings Away by Fritz Leiber, The Doom That Came to Sarnoff by H.P. Lovecraft, Hell's Guard by C.L. Moore, and The Testament of Athamas by Clark Ashton Smith. I did skip Hell's Guard by C.L. Moore. That is a Jarell of Jory story There are so few of those, like only 5 or 6, that we are going to be covering all of those in a single episode when I get to that collection. So in this introduction by DeCamp, I do think it is important to pay special attention to these introductions, especially when you are first getting into a certain kind of literature. We can learn a lot from how the editors word their introduction and who they mention. So in this introduction, DeCamp describes heroic fantasy thusly. Heroic fantasy is the name of a class of stories laid not in the world as it is or was or will be, but as it ought to have been to make a good story. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at heroic fantasy, which he does call this genre heroic fantasy. He goes on to saying that all these are stories where all men were mighty, all women were beautiful, all problems were simple, and all life was adventurous. He argues that these stories were not written as allegory or metaphor, but were written to, and not written to teach lessons or pontificate on life's grander meaning. These stories were written solely to entertain, to enthrall, to excite, and to astonish. I don't necessarily agree with that these are pure escapism. And that's one thing that I do want to look at in going through this project. Many of these early stories from the 1930s, when the sword and sorcery genre really came to light with Howard, are definitely Depression era stories. The entire rise of pulp fiction was birthed out of the Great Depression, of offering entertainment cheaply to people who needed it. But that wasn't pure escapism, because those types of problems and lives were reflected in these stories. These Depression era fantasy stories were about people, specifically men, who were just trying to survive. They were survival stories. You had these men during the Depression who, back then it was very common to tie your entire persona into your job, into being the breadwinner for your family. And when that was ripped away with unemployment, a lot of these men found themselves with their backs up against it, and they needed to find out how to survive and how to be who they were. And I think that is evident in a lot of the early sword and sorcery stories. And that is from the first wave. And then as we move on closer to the Vietnam War, and I think maybe the second wave of sword and sorcery, I think we see that some of the stories become allegories for the Vietnam War. One story we're going to be taking a look at a little later is definitely a Vietnam allegory. So I think it's important to look at when the stories were written and what we can learn about them and the way that they reflected the time in which they were written, while also recognizing the fact that they were written to entertain. But in this introduction, he gives a brief survey of fantasy fiction starting back in the late 1800s with William Morris and George MacDonald, two early fantasy authors that I am familiar with. He then moves on to Dunsany and then Tolkien, and into the pages of the weird tales and the pulps of the 1930s. So my 3 favorite stories in this collection. The first is Shadows in the Moonlight by Robert E. Howard, published in 1934. Now, I know in my introduction to the series, I said I wasn't going to be focusing on Conan, but I wasn't going to be actively avoiding Conan. And it is impossible to actively avoid Conan. And this story is a perfect example of why, because it is such a prototypical and just great story of sword and sorcery and adventure. In this story, Conan, he accidentally rescues an escaped slave woman named Olivia, and Olivia ends up being one of only 2 or 3 really well-written female characters from all 3 of these anthologies, and she's really cool. And Conan and Olivia, they take turns rescuing each other and helping one another. They share this wonderfully charming relationship that was quite surprising to me. I had never read this story before. And in this story, Conan accidentally rescues her, and then together they fight off a group of pirates. They fight a massive beast of a primate, and they avoid the ensorcelled grasps of these magical metal men that reminded me of the 18 bronze men of the Shaolin, if you guys are familiar with that movie and that trope from Kung Fu cinema. And then at the end, Conan promises to make Olivia his fair companion, the queen of the pirates, as they embark aboard this pirate vessel and sail off into the horizon. Very good story. I absolutely loved it. My second favorite story in this collection was from Dunsany, and that is the distressing tale of Thangolbrine the jeweler, with a jeweler being a kind of a synonym for a thief. Now, in his typical style of brevity, in just a few pages, Dunsany lays out this entire epic quest for this jewel called the Dead Man's Diamond that is at the altar of a spider god named Lolo. And he does an amazing job of detailing this quest in only a few pages. What any other author would probably take an entire book to describe, Dunsany does it in like 5 pages. And I did want to read this amazing paragraph here for you guys. How nimbly he threaded his way through the pits of snood, now like a botanist scrutinizing the ground, now like a dancer leaping from crumbling edges. It was quite dark when he went by the towers of Tor, where archers shoot ivory arrows at strangers, lest any foreigner should alter their laws, which are bad, but not to be altered by mere aliens. At night they shoot at the sound of the stranger's feet. O Thangolbrine, Thangolbrine, was ever a jeweler like you? He dragged 2 stones with him by long cords, and at these the archers shot. Tempting indeed was the snare that set in Woth, the emeralds loose set in the city's gate. But Thangolbrine discerned the golden cord that climbed the wall from each, and the weights that would topple upon him if he touched one. And so he left them, though he left them weeping. And at last he came to Theth. There all men worship Lolo, though they are willing to believe in other gods, as missionaries attest, but only as creatures of the chase, for the hunting of Lolo, who wears their halos, so these people say, on golden hooks along his hunting belt. And from Theth he came to the city of Mung, and the temple of Mungaling, and entered and saw the spider idol Lolo, sitting there with Dead Man's Diamond glittering on his lap, and looking for all the world like a full moon, but a full moon seen by a lunatic who had slept too long in its rays. For there was Dead Man's Diamond, a certain sinister look, and a boding of things to happen that are better not mentioned here. The face of the spider god was lit by that fatal gem, and there was no other light. In spite of his shocking limbs and the demonic body, his face was serene and apparently unconscious. Wow! Just, man, what a paragraph. So good. If you're familiar with Dunsany, you know what a good writer he is, but his prose was just head and shoulders towering over his contemporaries. But now we're to my favorite story in this collection, and a very surprising one, and that is from Henry Kuttner in 1939, The Citadel of Darkness. Now, before I started this project, I only knew Kuttner as a writer of science fiction. I didn't know that he had written this kind of sword and sorcery and adventure and heroic fiction, and he has proven to me in these 3 collections to be just a master at this genre, and I'm so looking forward to reading more. And this is perhaps the most typical sword and sorcery in this collection, and it reads almost like a Dungeons and Dragons module. So this story focuses on a character named Prince Raynar and his Nubian servant / bodyguard Eblik. And it is their heroic quest to infiltrate the Citadel of Darkness and vanquish an evil sorcerer named Gyar. So Eblik, being a Nubian, it's mentioned numerous times, as is his black skin. And while Raynar is obviously in a position of power over his companion, there is a mutual respect between the two that does transcend this master-slave dynamic. So I enjoyed their relationship, and I think it transcends the problematic genesis of the master-slave dynamic. But this heroic adventure here is just amazing. It has a series of chamber tests and traps that the heroes must overcome in various ways, including things like the sign of the basilisk, the sign of the black flower, the sign of the serpent, and the sign of the fish of Ea. Each being more deadly than the last. This really does feel like you are reading an outline for a game that I might cover on this on the Dungeon Dive. It's so much fun, just perfect amount of adventure and plot. Super well written, so highly recommended. The Citadel of Darkness and Henry Kuttner. I think I might have said Harry Kuttner earlier, and I apologize for that. But yeah, it is in fact Henry Kuttner. I don't know why I keep saying Harry. If I've said Harry, I apologize. All right, so next we're moving on to the Spell of Seven. Oh, I think I should mention two stories that I didn't quite like. Let's back up. Two stories I didn't quite like in Swords and Sorcery, and those were from two masters. And that is The Doom That Came to Sarnath from H.P. Lovecraft, published in 1935, and The Testament of Athamas from Clark Ashton Smith in 1932. Both of those stories feel really out of place here. They aren't really adventurous. They're very passive. They don't have that like immediate power and that immediate raw energy that so many of the stories in this genre do. I do absolutely love some Clark Ashton Smith, and I do love some H.P. Lovecraft, but those two stories just really didn't do it for me in this collection. So now we're looking at The Spell of Seven, and that was published in 1965. This is my favorite cover art of the three, one of my favorite covers of all time, and that of course is also done by Virgil Finlay. In this introduction, DeCamp says, "Do you feel like saying to hell with the world's problems for a while? Let's read something for fun." And to that I say hurrah. Especially in 2020 and 2021, which there just seems to be a lot of crap going on in the world. So it's nice to read something like this. So this collection contains the following: Bazaar of the Bazaar by Fritz Lieber, The Dark Eidolon, Clark Ashton Smith, The Horde of Giblins, Lord Dunsany, The Hungry Hercynian by L. Sprague de Camp, Kings in Darkness by Michael Moorcock, Mazirian the Magician from Jack Vance, and Shadows in Zambula from Robert E. Howard. So my third favorite story here is Kings in Darkness from Michael Moorcock, 1962, and that is an Elric story. In doing some research, according to Michael Moorcock, this was originally outlined as a Conan story by James Cawthorne. Now, James Cawthorne is an artist who worked with Moorcock and really helped develop the look of the Elric character. And we are going to be devoting an episode in the future to James Cawthorne's art. According to DeCamp in his introduction, this was one of Moorcock's least favorite Elric stories, but I happen to really like it. Now, knowing that it was a Conan story, maybe you can tell it's a little more adventurous, it's a little more full of bravado than some of the Elric stories, but I don't think it reads too much like a Conan story. But here we are joining Elric and his odd-faced human companion Moonglum, and those two, while traveling, they meet a woman named Zarazonia, who Zarazonia later becomes, I think, Elric's wife. She becomes Elric's wife, if I'm remembering correctly. But Elric and Moonglum, they take on a quest to escort Zarazonia back to her homeland. But as we know, no good deed goes unpunished. Soon the three are they're ambushed by bandits. All of their possessions are stolen, so they have to infiltrate the bandits' camp to get their stuff back. And in doing so, they discover this strange cult. This god is resurrected, and they have to battle against these like warlock powers, these magical forces. And it's such a great example of that no good deed goes unpunished trope. It perfectly illustrates one of the things I love about the Elric stories is this balance of humor and gloom. And especially Elric's banter with his companions is really well done. And I think Moorcock perfectly exemplified in this story. My second favorite story, here we're going to come to the love part of the love-hate relationship with Clark Ashton Smith, and that is the Dark Eidolon in 1953. Damn it, what a fantastic story. This thing is just brilliant. It's so twisted, brutal, and devious. I can almost picture Quentin Tarantino directing a version of this because it reads like this weird fantasy grindhouse story of revenge. It's all about this young street orphan who is trampled by a lord's horse. He leaves the city, the orphan does. He learns sorcery and like necromancy, and then he returns to the city to get revenge on the lord that left him for dead. And I do want to read a passage from this story here. In the wide intervals between the tables, the familiars of Nemerah and his other servants went to and fro incessantly, as if a phantasmagoria of ill dreams were embodied before the emperor. Kingly cadavers in robes of time-rotten brocade, with worms seething in their eye pits, poured a blood-like wine into cups of the opalescent horn of unicorns. Lamias, trident-tailed and four-breasted chimeras, came in with fuming platters lifted high by their brazen claws. Dark-headed devils, tongued with lolling flames, ran forward to offer themselves as ushers for the company. And before Zetula and Obexa, there appeared a curious being with the full-fleshed lower limbs and hips of a great black woman, and the clean-picked bones of some titanic ape from there upward. And this monster signified by certain indescribable becks of its finger bones that the emperor and his odalisque were to follow it. Man, talk about evocative prose there. So grotesque and just eerie. Very good story of revenge. My number one favorite story in this collection is The Bazaar of the Bazaar, Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story, 1963. I want to be careful with how much we cover Fafhrd and Grey Mouser in anthologies because we are going to be devoting a couple of episodes to them later. But I did read this one in here, and this is maybe my second favorite Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story. I think this is a premier example of the genre, and it perfectly illustrates his daft sense of humor and the way he pits his two characters against each other without them becoming full-blown antagonists towards each other. So both of these two heroes, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, Fafhrd being like a barbarian, the Grey Mouser being a thief. They are under the employ of patron wizards, Ngambel of the Seven Eyes and Shilba of the Eyeless Face. And these two patron wizards, they send Fafhrd and Grey Mouser into this bazaar, this store, that the bazaar is run by a group of alien demon beings called the Devourers, who they set up shops all around the land to trick people into buying trash and garbage, luring them into their stores to devour and capture them. And then the Grey Mouser, he gets conned by the Devourers and is almost captured. Fafhrd, he receives the gifts from his patron wizard, the blindfold of true seeing and the cloak of invisibility. Hello, Dungeons and Dragons there. So he's able to go in and fight the Devourers and rescue the Grey Mouser. Just a fantastic story, full of just high adventure and a lot of fun. My least favorite story in here was The Hungry Hyrcanian, and it was actually written by L. Sprague de Camp, 1953. It's just not a good story in any way. It's poorly written, it's confusing, it's convoluted. The whole thing is like this sad story of a slave girl who gets bought, sold, stolen, raped, traded, bought, sold. It goes nowhere, and it's not adventurous, it's not exciting, and it's not a very good story. And then one story I did have a problem with here is Shadows of Zambula from Robert E. Howard, 1935. I don't think that Howard was a malicious racist. He definitely had some racist tendencies, some things he was dealing with, some demons, that is for sure. But in this story, it's basically about Conan killing a bunch of black people. They happen to be cannibals, but I feel like Howard mentions the fact that they're black more times than he mentions the fact that they're cannibals. At one point, Conan rescues a woman who says that these cannibals were lying in wait beneath a dark arch. Black men, like great hulking apes. Oof. Yeah, the story just has not aged well, and it was hard for me to read because of some of the racial qualities that Howard used to describe the antagonists. But we're going to see later, when we get into the Solomon Kane stories, which I actually like Solomon Kane more than Conan. Howard can write well-written and good black characters. So we will leave that for another time. And finally, we are to my favorite of the three, and that is Warlocks and Warriors. I like it so much that I have ended up replacing my barely holding together mass market paperback with a beautiful first edition hardback from Berkeley Putnam. It almost looks like this thing has never been read before. I was very happy I got this at the price I did. And it's one of my prize books in my collection now. This has a beautiful wraparound cover by Jim Steranko. We will definitely be seeing more Jim Steranko art later, but I really do like this wraparound cover. It is quite nice. And this collection is just fantastic. Story for story, it has so many great entries in here. And the first one, I just want to highlight something briefly, and that was by, well, let's take a look at the stories here real quick. So we have Turotau by Ray Capella, The Gods of Neon Parma by Lynn Carter, The Hills of the Dead, Robert E. Howard. That is a Solomon Kane story that I like a lot. Thunder in the Dawn by Henry Kuttner, Thieves' House by Fritz Lieber, Black God's Kiss by C.L. Moore. I did skip both of those two stories because we are going to visit them later. Chubu and Sheemish by Lord Dunsany, The Master of the Crabs by Clark Ashton Smith, The Valley of Spiders by H.G. Wells, and The Bells of Shoredan by Roger Zelazny. So this first story, Turotau by Ray Capella, really interesting. It's basically a work of fan fiction that was published in a fanzine called Amra, which was all about a fanzine all about Conan. I think it was taken from, I think Amra was like a name that Conan took at one point or something like that. But this was a fanzine that also had articles and stories contributed by professional authors like Lynn Carter, which Lynn Carter's story in here was also published in Amra. But as a work of fan fiction, this is a fantastic story, and it is definitely a work of Vietnam allegory, written in 1965. I mean, if you strip away the fantasy elements, it's about a group of soldiers in a boat going up a river, infiltrating this palace that is part of the natives, these like pygmies who are employing guerrilla warfare tactics. So to say that that was a story of pure entertainment, I just can't buy it, because I really do feel like that was a story of the Vietnam era. But let's move on to my three favorite stories in this collection. The first is The Gods of Neon Parma from Lynn Carter, 1966. Again, another story that appeared in the pages of the Amra fanzine. And this is just a wonderfully written, beautifully, a joyous story. This story is so like light-hearted and just it's almost like a feel-good story. It's heartfelt, and it's a welcome relief from like the violence and grit found in so many of these stories. It is definitely a work of Dunsany pastiche, written in the style of the Gods of Pagana. So The Gods of Neon Parma, this tells the story of this alabaster city, and Carter uses that word alabaster like 24 times in this story. But The inhabitants of the city have displeased the gods, and so the gods send one of their own as a spy, the god of fishermen, to investigate and report back with his findings. But the god spy, he ends up falling like madly in love with the city, his new normal mortal life, and its inhabitants. And so he decides to abandon his divinity and live in this city with the mortals. Super, super cool story. I absolutely loved it. Lynn Carter can be kind of hit or miss as far as his prose and his style goes, but when he hits, I think he is very good, and that story kind of proves it there. Excuse me. I want to put this cover back on just so you guys have something a little bit more interesting to look at than something bright red there. All right, so my second favorite story in this collection was, let me find it in my notes here, and that was The Bales of Shoredan by Roger Zelazny, 1966. So I am a little familiar with Zelazny. I've read the Amber series, I've read Lord of Light, and a few other short stories. I don't think I ever knew he wrote in such a typical sword and sorcery fashion, and this story, The Bales of Shoredan, completely blew my mind. And it was my introduction to his character, Divlish the Damned. And this character in his story arc has escaped from like 200 years of torture in hell. And his whole quest is to get revenge on the evil warlock who sent him to hell. And what an awesome story. It's the closest thing I've read to something like Elric, in that it is just bizarre. Divlish the Damned, he rides this black metal horse named Black, and Black's hooves create huge sparks of electricity and lightning as he gallops across the land. And in this story, he needs to go to this city of the damned, the city of the dead, Shoredan, to ring the bells of Shoredan, to call forth a cursed legion who will follow Divlish, who is a half-man, half-elf, back to a city to enact revenge. And just a wonderfully written story, full of so much evocative imagery. Super well written. I do have now in my possession the 2 Divlish books, and we're definitely going to be spending some more time on that character. And my number one favorite story in here, we're going to return to Henry Kuttner, and that is 1938's The Thunder in the Dawn. What a great story. The longest story by far in all 3 of these anthologies, practically a novella. I think it's over 70 pages. And this was my introduction to Kuttner's character Elec of Atlantis. So this story takes place in the Atlantean era, which is like a pre-Conan era. And in this story, we join Elec and his rogue, drunken companion Lycon, Valia, Elec's lover, and this druid named Delan. And together, this band of adventurers, they travel to the northern regions of the Atlantean lands to rescue Elec's brother and do battle with an evil warlock named Elf and the giant Vikings of the north. And just this story is just page for page, is packed with so much action, so much adventure, great banter between the characters, lots of magic and fighting and action. Just an absolutely fantastic story. I am so glad that I have been introduced to Kuttner's sword and sorcery fiction, and I cannot wait to read more. I have since purchased all of the Elec stuff, so I will be focusing on that character in the future. So these 3 anthologies, that was it. That's a long review. I rank them thusly: Warlocks and Warriors, The Spell of 7, and Swords and Sorcery. If I were to rank them by cover art, I would rank them The Spell of 7, Warlocks and Warriors, and Swords and Sorcery. You really can't go wrong with any of these. These are great introductions to the genre. They can serve as very strong launching points to discover new stories and new characters and new authors for people who are just getting into sword and sorcery as complete novices. And even me coming into it, knowing a little bit, I am still super grateful I read these because I made some great discoveries, revisited some all-time favorites, and just had a really good time. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this long review. Next up, after spending so much time with so many male authors and so much testosterone in these characters, I am purposefully moving on to a female author, and we are going to be taking a look at Tanith Lee's The Birthgrave. So stay tuned for that, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.